Hello my friends, welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them. And don't forget to subscribe. Now relax. Our story is ready to unfold. Chapter 1. The Fog of Progress. The mist came down over Loch Dubh like a shroud, thick and white and utterly impenetrable. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his small croft house and surveyed what he could see of his domain, which was precisely nothing beyond the stone wall of his garden. It was the sort of highland mist that turned the world into wool, muffling sound and swallowing light until a man could barely see his hand in front of his face. Hamish rather liked it. On a day like this, no one would expect him to patrol the village or fill out paperwork or do anything remotely resembling actual police work. He was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and red hair, and he possessed what his superiors at headquarters in Strathbane considered a lamentable lack of ambition. Hamish did not consider it lamentable at all. He had his croft, his sheep, his dog Lugs, and his domesticated wildcat Sonsie. He had the respect of the villagers and the freedom to live his life as he pleased. A promotion would mean a transfer to Strathbane, that dreary industrial town with its grey housing estates and its traffic and its crime. The very thought made him shudder. "Come along, Lugs," he said to the dog, a large mongrel with blue eyes and enormous ears that gave him a perpetually startled expression. "Let's feed the sheep before this mist gets any thicker." Lugs followed him out into the garden, where Sonsie, the wild cat, materialised from the whiteness like a striped ghost. The cat had been injured when Hamish found her, and he had nursed her back to health. She had never quite left, and Hamish had never quite encouraged her to do so. He was scattering feed for his small flock when he heard the sound of a car engine, far too loud and far too fast for the narrow road into Loch Dubh. Hamish straightened up, frowning. Only a fool or a stranger would drive like that in this mist. The car, when it appeared through the whiteness, proved to be an enormous black Range Rover with London plates. It pulled up outside the Loch Dubh Hotel with a squeal of brakes that sent the village dogs into a frenzy of barking. Hamish sighed. Strangers in Loch Dubh were rarely good news. By evening, the entire village knew about Reginald Vance. News travelled fast in the Highlands, particularly bad news. Hamish learned the essentials while nursing a dram of whisky in the Loch Dubh Hotel, where the locals had gathered to discuss this unwelcome visitor. Vance was a consultant, they said, a Peat to Power consultant from London. He had been hired by the landlord, that distant figure who owned vast tracts of Highland bog and never set foot on them, to modernise the peat industry, mechanise it, industrialise it, turn the ancient misty bogs into a proper commercial operation, and in doing so, he planned to ban the locals from cutting peat for their own fires. "It's our peat," said Archie McLean, the fisherman, his weathered face red with fury. "Our fathers cut it, and their fathers before them. What right has some London man to come here and tell us we cannae warm our own homes?" Now, said a soft voice from the corner. "I'm sure Mr. Vance doesn't understand our ways yet. Perhaps if we explain things calmly." Hamish turned to see Mrs. Mary Ross, a widow who ran a small shop selling traditional soaps made from bog myrtle and peat extracts. She was a small, neat woman with greying hair and a gentle manner that made everyone in the village protective of her. She had moved to Loch Dubh some years ago, after her husband's death, and had quietly become part of the fabric of village life. "Explained?" bellowed Archie. "I tried to explain, and the man threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on what he called private land." "Private! As if the bog belonged to anyone but itself!" Hamish had met Vance earlier that afternoon, when the man had marched into the police station demanding that Hamish enforce various property laws that Vance claimed were being violated. Hamish had been polite but unhelpful, explaining that Highland tradition often trumped written law, and that a wise man learned to bend with the wind. Vance had not appreciated the advice. He was a large man, running to fat, with a sort of plummy London accent that set Highland teeth on edge. He wore expensive waterproof gear that looked like it had never seen actual weather, and he had the air of a man who believed his money and his education made him superior to everyone around him. "You're a police officer," Vance had said, jabbing a thick finger at Hamish's chest. "Your job is to enforce the law, not to philosophize about tradition. I expect you to support me in this venture, or I'll be speaking to your superiors about your dereliction of duty." Hamish had smiled his pleasant, lazy smile and done absolutely nothing. Now, in the hotel bar, the arguments grew louder and more heated. Vance himself arrived just before 8, pushing through the door with all the subtlety of a battering ram. "Ah, the locals," he said, surveying the room with barely concealed contempt. "I'm glad you're all here. Saves me the trouble of speaking to you individually. I want to make something perfectly clear. The peat bogs are now under proper management. There will be no more casual cutting, no more trespassing, no more helping yourselves to what you seem to think is a communal resource. Anyone found on the bogs without authorization will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The room erupted. Voices rose in anger, fists slammed on tables, and for a moment Hamish thought there might be actual violence. He stood, ready to intervene, but Mrs. Mary Ross was faster. "Please," she said, stepping between Vance and the advancing Archie McLean. "Please, everyone, let's not lose our tempers. Mr. Vance, perhaps you would join me for a cup of tea? I'm sure we can find some common ground if we just talk calmly." Her gentle voice seemed to diffuse the situation. Archie stepped back, muttering. Vance looked at Mary with something approaching approval. "Finally," he said, "someone sensible. Yes, Mrs. Ross. I would be delighted to have tea with you. At least one person in this godforsaken village understands civilization." Hamish watched them go, Mary leading Vance to a quiet corner table, while the other villagers glared and muttered. She brought him tea, spoke to him in her soft, soothing voice, and gradually the man's bluster seemed to fade. Later, as Hamish was leaving, Mary caught up with him outside. The mist had grown even thicker, if such a thing were possible, turning the streetlights into dim golden blurs. "Constable Macbeth," she said, pressing a basket into his hands. "I brought you some fresh scones. I thought you might need something warm on a night like this." Hamish thanked her and walked home through the fog, Lugs trotting at his heels. The scones were still warm and they smelled of butter and comfort. He went to bed that night thinking that perhaps Mary Ross would be able to smooth things over with Vance. She had a gift for making peace, that woman. A real gift. He had no idea how wrong he was. The morning brought news of murder, and by the time the sun had burned through the mist, nothing in Lochdoub would ever be quite the same again. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery in the Mist. The telephone's shrill ring dragged Hamish from a dream involving fresh scones and a promotion he was successfully avoiding. He groped for the receiver in the darkness, knocking over a glass of water in the process. "Macbeth," he mumbled. "Hamish, you'd better get yourself up to the old peat cuttings," came the agitated voice of Willie Dunn, one of the local crofters. "There's been an accident, or maybe not an accident. You'd better come quick." Hamish was pulling on his uniform before Willie had finished speaking. Whatever else he might be, he was no fool when it came to the serious business of his job. Lugs raised his head from his basket, decided the hour was unreasonable, and went back to sleep. Then the dawn was breaking grey and cold over the bogs as Hamish drove his ancient Land Rover up the rutted track. The mist had lifted somewhat, leaving behind a thin, creeping fog that clung to the hollows and made the whole landscape look like something from a Gothic novel. Willie was waiting by the side of the track, his face pale in the weak light. "It's bad, Hamish," he said. "Real bad. I was checking my Peats when I saw him. That London man. Vance." Hamish followed Willie across the spongy ground, his boots squelching in the wet peat. The smell of the bog was strong in his nostrils, that distinctive highland scent of ancient vegetation and dark water. He had grown up with that smell, and it usually brought him comfort. Not this morning. Reginald Vance lay sprawled in a shallow peat cutting, his expensive waterproof jacket dark with moisture and something else. His head was at an odd angle, and beside him lay a heavy antique cast-iron tushkar, the traditional peat cutting tool that had been on display in the village library just yesterday. Hamish knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. He didn't need to check for a pulse. The man was thoroughly dead, his skull crushed by what must have been a vicious blow from that iron tool. "Did you touch anything, Willie?" he asked. "Not a thing. I took one look and ran back to call you." Hamish studied the ground around the body. The peat was soft here, but whoever had killed Vance had been careful. There were footprints, but they were confused and overlapping, difficult to read. What struck him most was the location. This particular cutting was surrounded by treacherous bog, the kind of ground that could swallow a man if he didn't know exactly where to step. The killer had navigated this terrain in the dark, in the mist, without a flashlight that Hamish could see any evidence of, and had struck with precision. That took knowledge, local knowledge. He secured the scene as best he could with what he had in the Land Rover, then reluctantly made the call he'd been dreading. Within the hour, Strathbane would descend on Loch Dubh like a plague of locusts, and with them would come Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair arrived at 8:30, red-faced and belligerent, trailing his usual entourage of detectives and scene-of-crime officers. He was a fat man with a fondness for whiskey and a passionate hatred of Hamish Macbeth, whom he considered an uppity Highlander who had made him look foolish on more than one occasion. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair barked, pushing past Hamish to survey the scene. "What have we got here? And don't give me any of your Highland mysticism. I want facts." Hamish gave him the facts, brief and to the point. Blair grunted and began barking orders at his team, most of which were contradictory and several of which were simply foolish. Hamish watched in silence, cataloguing details that Blair's shouting was causing everyone to overlook. The scene of crime officers set to work, photographing and measuring and bagging evidence. Hamish noticed one of them carefully lifting the tushkar into an evidence bag. It was an old piece, well maintained, with the maker's mark still visible on the iron. He made a mental note to check who had borrowed it from the library display. "Constable Macbeth," came a soft voice behind him. He turned to find Mrs. Mary Ross, wrapped in a thick shawl against the morning cold. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Mrs. Ross," he said gently, "you shouldn't be here. This is no place for you." "I heard the news," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That poor man. I know he wasn't well liked, but to die like this. It's terrible." Blair, overhearing, lumbered over. "You knew the victim, did you, madam?" "I spoke with him last night," Mary said. "At the hotel. I tried to calm him down when the others were so angry with him. He was just doing his job, after all, however misguided." "And after you spoke with him?" "He left shortly after I did. I went home." "I live alone. Constable Macbeth can confirm it. I went straight to bed." Blair's piggy eyes narrowed. "Anyone see you go home?" "I don't believe so. The mist was very thick." Before Blair could pursue this line of questioning, Mary reached into her bag and produced a thermos and several cups. "I thought you and your men might appreciate some hot coffee," she said. "It's dreadfully cold out here on the bog." Blair's expression softened slightly. He did like his creature comforts. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Ross. Very thoughtful indeed." As the Strathbane detectives gratefully accepted the coffee, Mary drew a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I took the liberty of making a list," she said, handing it to Blair. "Everyone who was at the hotel last night when Mr. Vance made his announcement. And I noted which ones he specifically threatened with trespassing notices. I thought it might help your investigation." Blair beamed at her. "Now this is what I call a helpful witness, not like some people I could mention." He shot a glare at Hamish. "Organised, prepared. Thank you, Mrs. Ross." Hamish watched this exchange with interest. Mary was being almost too helpful, producing evidence and lists as if she'd been preparing for this moment. But then she was a naturally organised woman. She ran her shop with military precision, and she volunteered at the library where she kept the historical records in perfect order. Still, something about it niggled at him. After Mary had left, Pressing Hamish's hand sympathetically as she went, Blair gathered his team. "Right," he said, "this is going to be a quick one. We've got motive by the bucket load. Every man in that village wanted this Vance fellow dead. We've got means, that antique what's-it there. An opportunity. Well, the mist would have covered anyone's movements last night. We start interviewing the locals, and we start now. Someone's going to crack, mark my words." Hamish said nothing. He knew from long experience that Blair's investigations were about as subtle as a hammer to the head, and about as effective when it came to the complexities of Highland life. The villagers would close ranks, protecting their own, and Blair would bluster and threaten and get precisely nowhere. Unless Hamish could find the real killer first, and present the evidence in such a way that Blair could claim the credit. It was the only way to keep the innocent safe and maintain the peace in Lochdoub. And as the Strathbane team began their work, Hamish took one last look at the scene. The peat bog stretched away in all directions, ancient and patient, keeping its secrets as it had for thousands of years. Somewhere in that silence was the truth about who had killed Reginald Vance. And Hamish Macbeth, lazy constable and lover of the quiet life, knew he would have to find it. He drove back to the station, his mind already working through the possibilities. Lugs greeted him at the door, and Sonsi wound herself around his legs, purring. "Well, my friends," he said, "it looks like we've got ourselves a murder investigation, and I have the nasty feeling this one's going to be more complicated than it appears." Outside, the mist crept back across the village, soft and silent and full of secrets. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. Hamish knew that if he wanted to solve this case before Blair arrested half the village out of sheer bloody-mindedness, he needed to tap into Lochdoub's most valuable resource: gossip. The Highlands ran on gossip the way London ran on money. Every slight, every secret, every suspicious glance was noted, catalogued and discussed, over tea until the original incident had been polished into legend. If someone had seen something the night Vance died, the information would be circulating through the village network like water through the burns. He just had to know where to fish for it. His first stop was the Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, who lived in a neat cottage on the edge of the village and spent their days watching the comings and goings of Lochdoub with the dedication of professional spies. They answered the door together, as they did everything, two elderly spinsters in matching cardigans who had the unfortunate habit of repeating each other's statements. "Constable Macbeth," said Nessie. "Constable Macbeth," echoed Jessie. "Good morning, ladies," Hamish said, removing his cap. "I wonder if I might have a word." "About the murder," said Nessie. "The murder," repeated Jessie, nodding sagely. They ushered him into their sitting room, which smelled of lavender and old books. Within minutes, Hamish found himself seated in their best chair with a cup of tea and a plate of shortbread that would have fed a small army. "Terrible business," said Nessie, settling into her chair with the air of someone preparing for a long gossip. "That London man." "London man," agreed Jessie. "I don't suppose you saw anything unusual yesterday evening?" Hamish asked, knowing full well that the sisters saw everything unusual and most things that weren't. Nessie and Jessie exchanged meaningful glances. "Well," said Nessie slowly, "there was that young man." "Young man," confirmed Jessie. Hamish's interest sharpened. "What young man would that be?" "Down by the harbour," Nessie said. "Yesterday afternoon, before the mist got too thick. He was arguing with Mr. Vance." "Arguing with Mr. Vance? Could you describe him?" The sisters conferred in whispers. Then Nessie spoke. 30-ish, dark hair, city clothes, but not as fancy as Mr. Vance's. He looked angry." "Very angry," added Jessie. "Did you hear what they were arguing about?" Both sisters shook their heads regretfully. They had been too far away, and the wind had been blowing the wrong direction. Even the Curry sisters' legendary nosiness had its limits. Hamish filed this information away and made his escape after a third cup of tea, and a promise to keep them informed of developments. His next visit was to Angus MacDonald, who lived in a small cottage that seemed to lean into the hillside as if seeking shelter from the constant wind. Angus claimed to have the second sight, a claim that brought him a steady stream of tourists willing to pay for predictions about their futures. Hamish considered Angus a complete fraud, but a useful fraud. The old man's network of contacts throughout the Highlands was extensive, and he had a gift for ferreting out information that might prove valuable. He found Angus sitting by his peat fire, smoking his pipe and looking remarkably pleased with himself. "I've been expecting you, Hamish," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Of course you have," Hamish said dryly. "I don't suppose the second sight told you who killed Reginald Vance." "The spirits are not yet clear on that matter," Angus said with dignity. "But they whisper of secrets and old sins coming home to roost." "The spirits whisper a lot of nonsense," Hamish retorted. "What have you actually heard, Angus? And I mean heard with your ears, not your mystical third eye or whatever you're calling it these days." Angus chuckled. "You've no poetry in your soul, Hamish Macbeth, but since you ask, I've heard that young Callum Vane arrived in the village 2 days ago." "Callum Vane?" "Reginald Vance's nephew, from Edinburgh, staying at Mrs. Mackenzie's bed and breakfast, though he's been keeping himself to himself. Showed up without warning, according to Mrs. Mackenzie, and she says he looked like a man with troubles on his shoulders." This was interesting news indeed. Hamish made a mental note to visit Mrs. Mackenzie's establishment. "Anything else?" "Dr. Brodie has been looking worried," Angus said, puffing on his pipe. "More worried than usual, I mean. And Archie McLean's been drinking even more than normal, which is saying something." Hamish thanked him and stood to leave, but Angus raised a gnarled hand. "One more thing, Hamish. That nice Mrs. Ross came to see me yesterday morning." "Mary Ross?" "What did she want?" "A reading. Wanted to know if the spirits had any guidance for her about an important decision. She seemed troubled, though she tried to hide it behind that sweet smile of hers." Hamish frowned. "What did you tell her?" "I told her what I tell everyone, that the future is murky and the past has long shadows. She paid me £20 and left looking even more worried than when she arrived." The afternoon found Hamish at the Loch-Dubh Hotel, where he knew he'd find Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, Blair's second in command. Unlike his superior, Jimmy was a reasonable man who had developed a healthy respect for Hamish's methods over the years. He was also a man who appreciated a good whisky. Hamish bought them both a dram and settled into a quiet corner booth. Jimmy looked tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from spending hours following Blair's wild goose chases. "Tell me you've got something, Hamish," Jimmy said wearily. "Blair's about ready to arrest Archie McLean just to close the case. He's convinced the footprints by the body are from Archie's Wellingtons. Are they? The forensics team matched the boot print pattern. Same size, same treadwear. But that doesn't mean Archie killed anyone. Half the men in this village probably have the same boots." "I need to see the autopsy report," Hamish said quietly, "and any evidence that's come back from the lab." Jimmy looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he muttered. "Blair would have my head." "Blair's head is too full of ambition to notice what you're doing," Hamish said, refilling Jimmy's glass. "What does the report say?" They bent over the papers together. The autopsy confirmed what Hamish had suspected. A single blow from the tushkar, delivered with considerable force and precision. The angle of the strike suggested someone of average height, right-handed. Time of death was estimated between 10 in the evening and midnight. "No defensive wounds," Jimmy pointed out. "He didn't see it coming, or he couldn't react in time." "The mist," Hamish said thoughtfully. "You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you last night. Easy to sneak up on someone." "If you knew where you were going in the dark," Jimmy agreed. "That bog is treacherous. I nearly lost my footing 3 times this morning, and that was in daylight." Hamish studied a photograph of the murder weapon. "This tushkar. It was taken from the library display case sometime yesterday. I'll need to check who had access." "Blair's already interviewed the librarian," Jimmy said. "Mrs. Graham. She says the case wasn't locked. Anyone could have taken it. She noticed it was missing when she opened up this morning, but she thought maybe it had been borrowed for cleaning or some such." They talked for another half-hour, sharing information and theories. By the time Hamish left, he had a clearer picture of the physical evidence, even if the motive remained murky. He walked back to the station through the gathering dusk, his mind churning through possibilities. A young man arguing with Vance, a nephew from Edinburgh. Dr. Brodie looking worried. Archie McLean drinking more than usual, and Mary Ross, sweet helpful Mary, visiting Angus for a reading the day before the murder. Pieces of a puzzle, but not yet a picture. Luggs met him at the door, tail wagging hopefully. Hamish fed him and Sonsie, then made himself a simple dinner of soup and bread. As he ate, he reviewed what he knew and what he still needed to find out. Tomorrow he decided he would dig deeper into Reginald Vance's life. The man hadn't come to Lochdoub in a vacuum. He had a past, and somewhere in that past might be the key to his death. Outside, the mist rolled in again, and the village of Lochdoub settled into its secrets. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. Hamish spent the following morning doing what he did best, appearing to do nothing while actually accomplishing a great deal. He walked to Luggs through the village, stopping to chat with this person and that, accepting cups of tea and snippets of information with equal grace. To the casual observer, he was simply being his usual lazy self, avoiding real work by socialising. In reality, he was building a picture of Reginald Vance's final days in Lochdoub. The picture that emerged was not a pleasant one. Vance had spent his time systematically antagonising every person he encountered. He'd told Mrs. Mackenzie her bed and breakfast didn't meet basic hygiene standards. He'd informed the Reverend Wellington that the church needed modernising. He'd even had the audacity to suggest to the Italian restaurant owner that real Italian food bore no resemblance to what was being served in Lochdoub. In short, he'd been a thoroughgoing bastard. But being unpleasant wasn't a crime, and none of these petty insults seemed sufficient motive for murder. Hamish needed to understand what Vance had really been doing in Lochdoub, beyond his official role as a Peat consultant. The answer came to him as he was examining the rental cottage where Vance had been staying. Blair and his team had already gone through it once, taking away Vance's laptop and business papers. But Hamish had learned long ago that Blair's people often missed things. They looked for the obvious and ignored the subtle. The cottage was one of those modern holiday lets, all white walls and minimalist furniture, utterly devoid of character. Hamish moved through it slowly, getting a feel for how Vance had lived. The man had been tidy, almost obsessively so. His clothes hung in the wardrobe with military precision. His toiletries were arranged by size on the bathroom shelf. It was in the sitting room that Hamish's eye caught something odd. A landscape painting on the wall hung slightly askew, as if someone had brushed against it recently. He lifted it carefully from its hook. Behind it was a safe, hidden in the wall. Hamish smiled. Blair's team had missed it entirely, probably because they'd been too busy carting away the obvious evidence to look for the hidden kind. The safe was a simple combination model. Hamish tried Vance's birth date, which he'd noted from the man's driving licence details in Jimmy's report. Nothing. He tried variations, then sat back on his heels to think. What would an arrogant man like Vance use as a combination? Something he'd never forget. Something that confirmed his own sense of superiority. On a hunch, Hamish tried the digits that corresponded to the letters in Vance on a telephone keypad. The safe clicked open. Inside was a leather-bound ledger and a thick envelope of cash. Hamish photographed the contents with his phone before touching anything, then carefully removed the ledger. What he found in its pages made his blood run cold. Reginald Vance hadn't just been a Peat consultant, he'd been a blackmailer. The ledger was meticulous, listing names, dates, and sums of money. Each entry was accompanied by notes about property disputes, boundary disagreements, unregistered deeds, and other legal irregularities that Vance had uncovered through his access to land registry records. He had been systematically extorting money from people throughout the Highlands, threatening to report their minor infractions to the authorities unless they paid him to keep quiet. Hamish found 3 entries relating to Lochdoub residents. One was Dr. Brodie, something about an undeclared inheritance that should have gone through probate. Another was a crofter named Donald MacLeod, who apparently had no legal claim to the land he'd been farming for 30 years. The third made Hamish's eyebrows rise. Archie McLean owed money on his harbour shed, money borrowed from a loan shark in Strathbane. Vance had somehow discovered this and had been threatening to inform Archie's wife, who believed the shed was paid for. More than that, Vance had been preparing to seize the shed as payment for the debt, which he'd somehow acquired from the original creditor. Motive, Hamish thought grimly. Solid, compelling motive. He was replacing the ledger when he heard footsteps outside. Moving quickly, he closed the safe, rehung the painting, and was examining a bookshelf with apparent casualness when the door opened. It was Mary Ross carrying a basket. "Oh, Constable Macbeth," she said, startled. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "Just having a wee look around," Hamish said pleasantly. "What brings you here, Mrs. Ross?" She held up the basket. "I thought I should collect Mr. Vance's things before the landlord returns. The perishables, I mean. There's milk in the fridge and bread on the counter." It seemed wasteful to let it all spoil. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, the sort of thoughtful gesture Mary would make, and yet something about it bothered Hamish. Why would she have a key to Vance's cottage? Why would the landlord ask her to collect perishables when the police investigation was still ongoing? "That's very kind of you," he said, "but I'm afraid the cottage is still technically a crime scene. I can't let you take anything just yet." Mary's face fell. "Oh, of course. I should have thought. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking clearly. This whole business has me quite shaken." "It's shaken us all," Hamish agreed. "Did you know Mr. Vance well, Mrs. Ross?" "Not well, no. Just from that evening at the hotel. He seemed like a very driven man. Focused. Perhaps too focused on his work and not enough on people." "Did he ever come into your shop?" A brief hesitation. "Once. He asked about my soap-making process. He seemed interested in the traditional methods, though I suspect he was really evaluating whether it could be industrialized." She gave a small, sad smile. Everything was about efficiency with him, wasn't it? He couldn't understand that some things are valuable precisely because they can't be rushed or mechanized. Hamish walked her back to the door. As she left, he noticed she glanced back at the sitting-room wall, her eyes moving briefly to where the painting hung. Or was he imagining things? He returned to the safe after she'd gone, photographed every page of the ledger, then locked it away again. The evidence would have to be properly logged and processed, but not yet. If Blair got hold of it now, he'd arrest Archie, Dr. Brodie and Donald MacLeod before tea time, and the real investigation would end before it began. Back at the station, Hamish uploaded the photographs to his computer and began making notes. The blackmail operation had been going on for at least 6 months, and Vance had collected substantial sums. But none of the 3 Lochdubh residents had paid him yet. Their entries were marked as pending, with threatening notes about deadlines and consequences. Archie McLean's deadline had been the day before Vance died. Hamish sat back in his chair, thinking. The boots that matched the crime scene prints. The motive of a desperate man facing financial ruin and exposure. The violent argument at the pub. Blair would call it an open and shut case. But Hamish had learned to distrust the obvious. In his experience, when evidence pointed too neatly in one direction, someone usually wanted it to point that way. He was still pondering this when his phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded agitated. "Hamish, Blair's about to make an arrest. He's got a warrant for Archie McLean. The forensics came back on the boot prints, and there's more. They found fibres from Archie's jacket on the murder weapon." "When?" "Within the hour. Thought you should know?" Hamish thanked him and hung up. He had perhaps 45 minutes before Blair descended on Archie's house with all the subtlety of an invading army. He needed to work fast. He found Archie at the harbour, mending nets with the patient skill of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. The fisherman looked up as Hamish approached, and the constable saw fear flicker in his eyes. "I didn't do it, Hamish," Archie said quietly. "I know how it looks, but I didn't kill that man." "Tell me about that night," Hamish said. "All of it. And don't leave anything out, because Blair's coming for you, and I need the truth if I'm going to help you." Archie's weather-beaten face sagged. "I was at the pub, drinking more than I should have. That Vance, he'd been after me about the shed, saying I had to pay him or he'd tell my wife about the debt, maybe even take the shed itself. I was angry, Hamish. Angry enough to kill, if I'm being honest. But I didn't do it. Where were you between 10 and midnight? In the pub cellar. Hamish blinked. The cellar? Hiding from my wife. She'd been on at me to come home, but I couldn't face her, not with all this hanging over me. There, sir. So I snuck down to the cellar and had a few more drams until I passed out. I didn't wake up until morning. It was possibly the most pathetic alibi Hamish had ever heard. It was also probably true. Can anyone confirm this? The landlord found me there at 6 a.m, but I can't prove I was there all night. Hamish heard the sound of cars on the road above the harbour. Blair had arrived. Say nothing, he told Archie. Not a word until you have a lawyer. Do you understand? Archie nodded, his face pale. Hamish watched as Blair's team swarmed the harbour, and his resolve hardened. An innocent man was about to be arrested because the real killer was clever enough to leave a trail pointing away from themselves. Time to find out who that killer really was. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. Archie McLean's arrest proceeded with all the theatrical flourish Blair could muster. The detective chief inspector had clearly envisioned headlines, television cameras, perhaps even a commendation. What he got was a terrified fisherman who went quietly and a village that closed ranks like a Highland fortress. Hamish watched it all from a careful distance, his face impassive. He'd learned over the years that the best way to investigate under Blair's nose was to appear completely disinterested in the investigation. Let Blair think he was lazy, unmotivated, content to leave the real detective work to his betters from Strathbane. Meanwhile, Hamish would find the truth. His first move was to track down Callum Vane, the mysterious nephew from Edinburgh. He found the young man in the lounge of Mrs. near Mackenzie's bed and breakfast, nursing what looked like a substantial hangover and a cup of black coffee. Callum was perhaps 35 with his uncle's dark hair but none of his bulk. He had the lean, harried look of a man running from something, and when Hamish introduced himself, the young man's hand trembled as he set down his cup. I suppose you're here about my uncle, Callum said. I am. When did you arrive in Lochdoub, Mr. Vane? 2 days before he died. I needed to speak with him urgently. About what? Callum laughed bitterly. Money. What else? My uncle was a wealthy man, and I'm in rather desperate straits. Gambling debts, if you must know. I thought perhaps he might help family. And did he? He laughed in my face, said I was a wastrel and a disgrace to the family name. Then he told me he'd written me out of his will entirely, said I wouldn't see a penny of the Vance fortune. Hamish studied the young man carefully. Where were you the night he died? In my room, alone, drinking myself into oblivion after that charming conversation with dear Uncle Reginald. Callum met Hamish's gaze. I know how that sounds. No alibi, clear motive, family connection. But I didn't kill him, Constable. I'm a coward and a fool, but I'm not a murderer. The Curry sisters saw you arguing with your uncle by the harbour. Yes, that would have been the conversation I mentioned. He was quite public about his contempt for me. Wanted everyone to know what a disappointment I was. Did he mention any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted him dead? Callum snorted. Everyone wanted him dead, from what I could tell. He had a gift for making enemies. But specifically? No, he didn't confide in me. We weren't close. Hamish left the bed and breakfast with more questions than answers. Callum had motive, certainly, but something about the young man's defeated air suggested he lacked the spine for murder. His next stop was Dr. Brodie's surgery. The doctor was a solidly built man in his 50s, with kind eyes and capable hands that had delivered half the babies in Lochdoub and treated everything from sheep bites to heart attacks. He looked considerably less kind when Hamish mentioned Reginald Vance. The man was a vulture, Dr. Brodie said flatly. He discovered a mistake I made early in my career before I came to Lochdoub. A patient died due to a misdiagnosis. It was investigated at the time, and I was cleared of negligence. But the shadow of it never quite left me. Vance threatened to report it to the medical board, to drag it all up again unless I paid him to keep quiet. How much did he want? £10,000. Money I don't have. I told him to go to hell. Strong words, Doctor. I won't apologise for them. The man was scum. But I didn't kill him, Hamish. I'm a physician. I save lives, not take them. Where were you the night of the murder? Playing cards with Reverend Wellington at the manse. We had our usual Wednesday evening game. Started at 8, finished around midnight. The Reverend can confirm it. Hamish made a note to check with the Reverend, though he suspected the alibi would hold. Dr. Brodie might have wished Vance dead, but wishing and doing were different things entirely. He was walking back through the village when he encountered Mary Ross coming out of the post office. She brightened when she saw him, though Hamish noticed the dark circles under her eyes. Constable Macbeth, have you heard the news? They've arrested poor Archie. Surely there's been some mistake. Blair's convinced he has his man, Hamish said carefully. The evidence is fairly damning. But Archie wouldn't hurt a fly. Well, perhaps a fly, but not a person. He's all bluster, no action. She clutched her shopping bag. Is there anything I can do? Perhaps visit his wife, bring her some comfort? That would be kind of you, Mrs. Ross, she smiled. That sweet, gentle smile that made everyone in the village want to protect her. I'll do that this afternoon. The poor woman must be beside herself, she paused. Have you discovered anything else about Mr. Vance? Any other suspects? The investigation is ongoing, Hamish said, using the bland phrase that meant nothing and everything. Of course. Well, if there's anything I can do to help, you only need to ask. I want to see justice done. Hamish watched her walk away, her basket over her arm, the picture of a kindly village widow going about her charitable rounds. And yet that question about other suspects nagged at him. Why would she ask? Curiosity? Concern? Or something else? That evening Hamish made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Reverend Wellington, who confirmed that Dr. Brodie had indeed been at the manse until midnight on the night of the murder. The second was to a contact at the Strathbane Traffic Control Centre, requesting footage from the cameras on the main road out of Lochdew. The footage came through within an hour, and it confirmed what Callum Vane had claimed. His rental car had been captured on camera 50 miles from Lochdew at 11:15 on the night of the murder. Even if he'd driven like a madman, he couldn't have been at the Peat bog when Vance died. So Callum was clear, Dr. Brodie was clear. But Archie remained firmly in Blair's sights. Hamish fed Lugs and Sonsy, then sat down with a whisky to review his notes. 3 suspects, all with clear motives stemming from Vance's blackmail. 2 with solid alibis. 1 with a pathetic story about hiding in a pub cellar. The physical evidence all pointed to Archie. The boot prints, the jacket fibres. But Hamish's instincts, honed by years of Highland policing, told him something was wrong. The evidence was too neat, too convenient. Someone had been very careful to make sure it pointed in the right direction. He thought about the murder weapon taken from an unlocked display case in the library. Anyone could have taken it, but it required knowledge of what was in that case, and the peat bog location navigated in pitch darkness through treacherous ground. That required intimate familiarity with the land. His phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded drunk. "Hamish, I thought you should know. We found something else. A threatening note in Vance's cottage, stuffed behind a radiator. Must have fallen there during a struggle or something. It's in Archie's handwriting." "Are you certain it's his handwriting?" "Blair had it analysed. It's a match. Says if Vance doesn't back off about the shed, he'll regret it. Dated the day before the murder." Hamish closed his eyes. Another piece of evidence, perfectly timed, perfectly incriminating. Too perfect. "Jimmy, who found this note?" "One of the SOCOs. Blair's crowing about it, saying it proves premeditation." "I need the name of the SOCO. Why?" "Just humour me." Jimmy rustled some papers. "Says here it was logged by... Hang on. It was found by Mrs. Mary Ross, actually. She was helping Blair's team search the cottage, being her usual helpful self. She spotted it behind the radiator when she was cleaning up." Of course she did, Hamish thought. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat in the gathering darkness, pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind. Mary Ross, always so helpful, always providing evidence. Always in exactly the right place at the right time. He pulled out his phone and began searching through land registry records, something he should have done from the start. If Vance had access to these records, so did Hamish. What he found made his blood run cold. The Peat bog where Vance had died wasn't just any bog. According to records going back 50 years, it had once belonged to a family named Ross. The land had been seized in the 1970s during a bankruptcy proceeding, sold to pay debts to a company owned by a man named Gerald Vance, Reginald's father. Hamish sat back, his mind racing. Mary Ross, the Peat bog, the Vance family. Suddenly the helpful widow didn't look quite so innocent anymore. He had a lot more digging to do. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish knew he needed to clear Archie's name before Blair's case became ironclad. The problem was that every piece of evidence pointed squarely at the fisherman, and Archie's own alibi was laughable. Even if Hamish suspected Mary Ross of something sinister, he had nothing concrete to prove it. What he needed was to eliminate the other suspects entirely and force Blair to look beyond the obvious. He started by making discreet inquiries about the threatening note. Mrs. Graham, the librarian, confirmed that Archie had indeed been in the library the day before the murder, returning some books about local fishing regulations. He'd been in a foul mood, she said, muttering about outsiders and their interference. But Mrs. Graham also mentioned something interesting. Mary Ross had been there too, volunteering as she often did, helping to organise the historical archives. She would have had ample opportunity to take the tushkar from the unlocked display case without anyone noticing. The handwriting analysis was harder to dismiss. Hamish managed to obtain a sample of the threatening note through Jimmy Anderson, and compared it to other examples of Archie's writing. It was a match, no question about it. Or was it? Hamish brought the note to Mrs. Graham, along with several of Archie's library request forms. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you keep historical documents here? Old letters, deeds, that sort of thing?" "Oh yes, we have quite a collection. Mrs. Ross has been cataloguing them all. She's wonderful with preservation work." Would any of these documents include letters written by Archie's grandfather? He was a fisherman too, wasn't he? Mrs. Graham's face lit up. "Oh yes, we have several boxes of correspondence from the fishing families. Such a valuable resource for local history." Hamish felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Someone with access to historical documents, someone skilled in preservation and archival work, could easily trace over old handwriting to forge a modern note. The pen pressure would be right, the letter formation would be authentic, and only the most sophisticated analysis would detect the forgery. He was pondering this when his phone rang. It was Donald MacLeod, the crofter whose name had appeared in Vance's blackmail ledger. "Hamish, I need to speak with you. Private like." They met on the windswept hillside above the village, where conversation couldn't be overheard. Donald was a taciturn man in his 60s, weathered by Highland winters and hard work. "That man Vance," Donald said without preamble. "He came to see me 2 days before he died. Said I had no legal right to my croft, that the original lease had expired and was never properly renewed. Said he'd report me to the landlord unless I paid him £5,000. What did you tell him?" "I told him to go to hell. This land's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather worked it, my father worked it, and I'll be damned if some London bloodsucker was going to take it from me." Donald's jaw worked. "I wanted to kill him, Hamish. I won't lie about that. But I didn't do it." "Where were you the night he died?" "At a sheep auction in Inverness. Stayed overnight at my cousin's house." "I can give you his number." Hamish took the details, knowing he'd verify them, but already believing the man. Donald MacLeod might have wanted Vance dead, but he was the sort who'd confront his problems head-on, not skulk about in the mist with an iron implement. The next development came from an unexpected quarter. Just after midnight, Hamish was awakened by Lugs's frantic barking. He pulled on his clothes and went outside to find Dr. Brodie standing in his garden, looking furtive and guilty. "Doctor," Hamish said mildly, "this is a bit late for a house call. Hamish, I need your help. Or rather, I need you to look the other way." The doctor was carrying a blood-stained burlap sack, and for one wild moment Hamish thought he'd been entirely wrong about the man's alibi. Then he caught a whiff of fish. "Is that what I think it is?" Hamish asked. Dr. Brodie had the grace to look sheepish. "Salmon, a rather large salmon, from the river. Technically speaking, I suppose you could say it was poached." Despite the late hour and the seriousness of the murder investigation, Hamish felt laughter bubble up in his chest. "You're out here at midnight bearing evidence of poaching? My wife would kill me if she found out. She's always going on about respecting the law and setting a good example. But the salmon was just sitting there in the pool, practically begging to be caught. And I've always believed the river belongs to everyone, not just the landlord who claims to own it." "And you were planning to bury it where?" "In the peat bog, actually. Thought I'd dig a wee hole, let nature take its course." Hamish sighed. Now this was Highland justice at its finest. Ignore the letter of the law in favour of tradition and common sense. He'd grown up with it, believed in it, and had no intention of arresting the village doctor for taking a fish from a river that had been fished by Highlanders since time immemorial. "I didn't see you tonight, Doctor," he said, "and you didn't catch any fish." Dr. Brodie's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Hamish. I owe you one." "You can repay me by confirming that you were definitely at the manse until midnight on Wednesday. No possibility you left early?" "None whatsoever. The Reverend and I played until his wife brought us tea at 11:45. Then we had a dram and discussed the sermon for Sunday. I didn't leave until well after midnight. After the doctor had hurried away with his contraband salmon." Hamish stood in the darkness thinking. Another suspect eliminated, another alibi confirmed. The net was tightening around Archie, and yet Hamish's certainty of the man's innocence only grew stronger. He spent the next day methodically checking every detail. Donald MacLeod's alibi checked out perfectly. The auction house confirmed his presence, and his cousin vouched for him staying the night. Callum Vane's movements were accounted for by traffic cameras and a petrol station receipt from 50 miles away. Dr. Brodie's alibi was rock solid, confirmed not just by Reverend Wellington, but by the Reverend's wife, who remembered serving them tea and biscuits at precisely 11:45. Every suspect cleared, every alibi verified, and yet someone had killed Reginald Vance. Hamish returned to the crime scene that afternoon. He's standing in the same spot where Vance's body had been found. The peat bog stretched around him, dark and ancient, keeping its secrets. He walked the perimeter, looking for something, anything that might have been missed. It was near the edge of the cutting that he found it, a tiny scrap of paper, so small it had been overlooked by the scene of crime officers. It was caught on a piece of heather, protected from the weather by an overhanging rock. Hamish extracted it carefully with tweezers and examined it in the fading light. It was vellum, the old-fashioned kind used for important documents, and along one edge was a trace of adhesive, the specialised archival glue used for preservation work, the kind of glue Mary Ross used in her volunteer work at the library. He photographed the scrap from every angle, then sealed it in an evidence bag. It wasn't much, just a fragment of old paper, but combined with everything else it was starting to form a picture. Mary Ross had access to the murder weapon. She had access to historical documents that could be used to forge handwriting. She had been first on scene to find the threatening note. She had a connection to the land where Vance died, and now he'd found a piece of her archival materials at the crime scene. Hamish drove back to the station as the sun set over the loch, painting the water gold and red. Lugs greeted him at the door, and Sonsi emerged from wherever she had been hunting to wind around his ankles. He fed them both, then sat down with his notes and a large whisky. Somewhere in all this information was the key to proving what he now suspected. That Mary Ross had carefully, methodically framed Archie MacLean for a murder she had committed herself. But suspicion wasn't proof, and proof was what he needed if he was going to save an innocent man and catch a very clever killer. Outside, the mist rolled in again, and Hamish settled in for a long night of thinking. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The trouble with investigating people you'd known for years was that they trusted you. They believed in your good intentions and your commitment to justice. This made them forthcoming with information, which was useful. It also made Hamish feel like a complete bastard when he had to dig into their private lives. But Archie McLean was sitting in a cell in Strathbane, and Blair was preparing to charge him with murder. Hamish didn't have the luxury of sensitivity. He started with Archie's wife, a formidable woman named Morag, who had a voice that could strip paint and a personality to match. She opened the door to Hamish with red-rimmed eyes and a handkerchief clutched in one hand. "They've taken him, Hamish," she said. "My Archie," as if he could hurt anyone. "I know, Morag. I'm working to prove his innocence, but I need your help." She ushered him into a sitting room that was aggressively clean, every surface polished to within an inch of its life. Hamish could see why Archie spent so much time at the pub. "Tell me about that night," he said gently. "When did you last see Archie?" "He went to the pub after tea around 7, said he needed to think. That Vance creature had been bothering him about the shed, making threats. Archie was beside himself with worry, though he tried not to show it." "And you didn't see him again that night?" "No. I assumed he'd come home late and slept on the sofa so as not to wake me. But when I got up in the morning, he wasn't there. I was furious, thought he'd been out all night drinking." Her voice broke. "I gave him such a tongue-lashing when he finally came home around 7, and all the while he'd been hiding from me like a frightened boy." "Hiding where?" "In the pub cellar, he says, too ashamed to face me with all his troubles." Hamish made sympathetic noises while his mind worked. If Archie had truly been in the cellar all night, someone must have seen him go down there. The pub would have had other customers until closing time at 11. He tracked down the landlord, Dougie MacLeod, who ran the Lochdoub Hotel with his wife. "Aye, Archie was drinking pretty heavily that night," Dougie confirmed. "Started around 7, kept going until closing. He was in a state, muttering about London bastards and threats and losing his shed." "Did he leave at any point?" "Not that I saw. He was at the bar most of the night, then at a corner table nursing his whiskey." "What about after closing?" Dougie looked uncomfortable. "Well, I didn't exactly see him leave. We were cleaning up, and when I went down to the cellar around 6 the next morning to tap a new barrel, there he was, passed out on some old sacks. Gave me a terrible fright." "So you can't confirm he was there all night?" "No, but where else would he have gone? The man was paralytic drunk by midnight. He could barely walk, let alone navigate a peat bog in the dark and commit murder." It was a fair point, but it wasn't proof. Hamish needed something more concrete. He spent the afternoon interviewing everyone who'd been at the pub that night. The picture that emerged was consistent. Archie drinking steadily, growing more morose as the evening wore on, and finally stumbling toward the back of the pub sometime around 11. Mrs. Mackenzie, who'd been having a nightcap at the hotel, reported seeing Archie weaving like a sailor in a storm as he headed toward the toilets. That was the last anyone had seen of him before Dougie found him in the cellar the following morning. It was circumstantial, but it was something. A man that drunk would have left a trail through the village if he'd tried to walk to the peat bog. Someone would have seen him, heard him. Hamish's next stop was Mrs. Mackenzie's bed and breakfast, where he confirmed Callum Vane's alibi one more time. The young man had been in his room, but Mrs. Mackenzie had heard him moving about, using the bathroom, playing music until late. "Terrible taste in music, that one," she sniffed. "All that modern rubbish with the thumping. Kept me awake until past midnight." So Callum was definitely at the bed and breakfast when his uncle was killed. Another suspect eliminated. Dr. Brodie's alibi remained unshakable. The Reverend's wife provided a detailed account of the evening, including the precise time they'd served tea, the topics of conversation, and the fact that the doctor's car had been parked outside the manse until well after midnight, because they could see it from the sitting room window. Every legitimate suspect accounted for. Every alibi verified and cross-checked. Which left Hamish with an uncomfortable truth. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Archie, but the timeline and circumstances made his guilt nearly impossible. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like Archie was the killer. the boot prints, the jacket fibres, the threatening note. All of it pointed to a careful, methodical frame-up. Hamish returned to his notes on Mary Ross. He'd been building a timeline of her movements, and what he found was revealing. She'd been at the library the day the Tushkar went missing. She'd been at the hotel the night Vance died, leaving around 9 o'clock by her own account. She'd been first on the scene the morning after, bringing coffee and helpful lists. She'd been the one to find the threatening note. And she had access to everything needed to frame Archie. His handwriting samples from the library, his schedule, his movements around the village. But what about her own alibi? Hamish realised with a start that he'd never properly checked it. Mary had said she'd gone straight home after leaving the hotel, that she lived alone and couldn't prove where she'd been. He decided to test that claim. The Curry sisters, bless their nosy souls, lived on the same street as Mary. If anyone had seen her movements that night, it would be them. "Mrs. Ross," said Nessie when Hamish posed the question. "Let me think." "Think," echoed Jessie. "She passed our window around 9, Nessie said. "We were watching the television. I remember because we commented on her being out in such terrible mist." "Terrible mist? Did you see her go into her house?" The sisters looked at each other. "Well, no," Nessie admitted. "We assumed she did, but we went back to our programme." "Programme? And you didn't see her again that evening?" Both sisters shook their heads. Hamish felt a cold excitement building. Mary had walked past the Curry sisters' house at 9 o'clock. But had she actually gone home? Or had she continued on into the mist toward the peat bog? He checked the geography. Mary's cottage was on the far side of the village from the bog, but there was a footpath that led from the back of her garden up onto the moor. Someone who knew that path intimately, who'd grown up in the area perhaps, could navigate it even in thick mist. And Mary, despite claiming to have moved to Lochdoub after her husband's death, seemed to know the area remarkably well for a relative newcomer. Hamish made one more visit that evening, this time to Angus MacDonald. The old seer greeted him with a knowing smile. "You've come to ask about the Ross family," Angus said. "How did you know that?" "Because I've been thinking about it myself since you were last here. Something about Mrs. Ross's visit bothered me, and I finally remembered what it was. She asked me about her father, Hamish. Asked if the spirits could tell her whether he'd forgiven her for leaving Lochdoub." "Her father?" "Aye, Duncan Ross. Died back in the 70s, poor soul. Lost everything to some London businessman who bankrupted him over a land deal. Duncan took his own life shortly after. His daughter, wee Mary, was sent away to live with relatives. I'd forgotten all about her until Mrs. Ross asked about him." Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place. Mary Ross. Mary Ross. Could be one and the same, I suppose, though if it is, she's kept that secret close to her chest all these years. Why would she come back here? "That," said Angus, "is what you need to find out." Hamish walked home through the darkness, his mind racing. Mary Ross had been born in Lochdoub. Her father had been destroyed by a London businessman. She'd returned years later, hiding a true identity, living quietly among people who didn't remember the girl she'd once been. And then Reginald Vance had arrived, son of the man who'd ruined her father, threatening to industrialise the very land that had once belonged to her family. Motive, Hamish thought. Clear, powerful, decades-old motive. Now he just had to prove it. Chapter 8. The Shopkeeper's Flaw. Hamish spent a sleepless night piecing together the puzzle. By dawn he had a theory that fit the facts, but theory wasn't evidence. What he needed was proof that would stand up in court and convince even Blair that he'd arrested the wrong person. He started with the timeline Mary had provided to DCI Blair on the morning after the murder. She'd been remarkably detailed, listing who had been at the hotel, what time various people had left, who had argued most vehemently with Vance. Blair, grateful for such organised assistance, had used it as the basis for his entire investigation. Hamish studied the document now with fresh eyes. Most of it was accurate, corroborated by multiple witnesses. But there was one small detail that nagged at him. Mary had noted that Vance mentioned researching historical bog plants, particularly the rare Ledum palustra that once grew in this region. Hamish took this information to Mrs. Graham at the library. She was an amateur botanist and kept extensive records of highland flora. "Ledum palustra," she said, frowning. "That's marsh Labrador tea. It hasn't grown wild in this part of the Highlands for over a century. The last documented sighting was in 1903, noted in the Highland Botanical Society records. Could Vance have been researching it? Why would he? The man was a peat consultant, not a botanist. Besides, there's no point researching a plant that's been extinct in the region for over 100 years. Unless, Hamish thought, someone wanted to appear knowledgeable about historical Highland plants. Someone who worked with historical records and had access to old botanical surveys. Someone who might have made a small telltale mistake by mentioning a plant that an actual researcher would never have been interested in. It was a tiny detail, the sort of thing most people would overlook. But Hamish had learned that murderers often betrayed themselves through small inconsistencies, attempts to appear helpful that revealed too much knowledge or the wrong kind of knowledge. His next discovery came from examining the threatening note more closely. He'd borrowed it again from Jimmy Anderson, promising to return it within the hour. Under magnification, the ink showed subtle variations in pressure. The words were formed correctly, the handwriting perfectly matched Archie's style, but there was something mechanical about it. Not quite traced, but not quite natural either. He photographed the note and compared it to samples of Archie's actual handwriting. The match was excellent. Too excellent. Real handwriting varied slightly from sample to sample, influenced by mood, fatigue, the surface being written on. This note showed none of that natural variation. Then he had an idea. He drove to the library and asked Mrs. Graham to show him the historical correspondence collection. "We have boxes of old letters," she explained. "Mrs. Ross has been wonderful about cataloguing them. She's even created tracings of some of the more damaged documents to preserve the handwriting patterns." Tracings, of course. "May I see the Maclean family correspondence?" Mrs. Graham led him to a filing cabinet where Mary had organised everything with meticulous care. Inside were letters from Archie's grandfather, written in a bold, distinctive hand that was remarkably similar to Archie's own. And beside them were sheets of tracing paper, carefully preserved, showing the outline of each letter. It would have been simple enough to use those tracings as a guide, creating a modern note that appeared to be in Archie's handwriting. Add some authentic linguistic touches, date it appropriately, and you had perfect forgery that would fool a handwriting analyst. Hamish photographed everything, careful not to disturb the files. This was evidence, but it was circumstantial. He needed more. That afternoon, he returned to the peat bog. The scene of crime officers had finished their work and the site was deserted. Hamish walked the perimeter slowly, trying to think like Mary Ross. She would have left her house around 9, using the back path to avoid being seen. The mist would have been thick by then, providing cover, but she would have needed a light source to navigate safely. He searched the path from the village to the bog, looking for any sign of her passage. It was slow work, made more difficult by the intervening days and the constant dampness that erased footprints and disturbed the ground. He was about to give up when Lugs, who had accompanied him on this expedition, began digging near the base of a standing stone. Hamish hurried over and found what the dog had uncovered, a small torch, the kind that hung on a keychain, half buried in the soft earth. It was a promotional item, the sort of thing businesses gave away. Reprinted on the side in faded letters was "Ross Heritage Soaps, Traditional Highland Crafts. Mary's Business." Hamish bagged it carefully. It wasn't much, but combined with everything else, it was starting to build a picture. His final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. He was walking back to his Land Rover when he noticed fresh flowers had been placed near the standing stone, a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in paper. He picked up the bouquet to move it out of his way and noticed the paper. It was old vellum, the kind used for important documents, and along the edge was a distinctive pattern of archival glue. He unfolded it carefully. It was a page from an old property deed, dated 1972, transferring ownership of this specific piece of bogland from Duncan Ross to Gerald Vance Enterprises. Someone had been here recently, leaving flowers at the spot where her father's land had been stolen. Someone who knew the exact location, who had kept this document for decades, waiting for the chance to reclaim what had been taken. Hamish sat down on the damp ground, holding the evidence in his hands. The flowers were fresh, placed within the last day or two. Mary had been here, standing at the place where her father's dreams had died, perhaps seeking some kind of closure after killing the son of the man who destroyed her family. It was a profoundly sad image, and despite knowing what Mary had done, Hamish felt a stab of sympathy for her. But sympathy didn't change the fact that she had committed murder and was content to let an innocent man take the blame. He drove back to the station and laid out all his evidence. The extinct plant that Vance supposedly mentioned. The forged note created using historical tracings. The torch from Mary's shop found near the crime scene. The vellum fragment with archival glue at the murder site. The property deed left as a memorial. And underneath it all, the decades-old motive, revenge for her father's death. It was a strong circumstantial case, but he needed one more piece. He needed to understand exactly how Mary had executed the murder and framed Archie so perfectly. He pulled out the forensic reports again, studying the boot prints and the jacket fibres. Both had been found at the scene, both matched Archie's possessions. But how had they gotten there if Archie had been passed out drunk in a pub cellar? The answer came to him with sudden clarity. Archie's Wellingtons had been kept in the shed by the harbour. Not in his house. Anyone could have borrowed them, used them at the crime scene, and returned them before morning. The same with his jacket, which he often left hanging in the pub's cloakroom. Mary had planned this meticulously. She'd waited for the right moment, when Archie was publicly angry at Vance, when he was drinking heavily, when his possessions were accessible. She'd taken the tush car from the unlocked library case, borrowed Archie's boots and jacket, navigated the familiar paths of her childhood to reach the bog, and struck Vance down with cold precision. Then she'd carefully left evidence pointing to Archie, returned his belongings, and presented herself the next morning as the helpful widow, guiding Blair's investigation exactly where she wanted it to go. It was brilliant in its way, and it had almost worked. Hamish picked up the phone to call Jimmy Anderson, then hesitated. If he turned this evidence over now, Blair would bungle the arrest, and Mary might find a way to destroy evidence or create reasonable doubt. No, this needed to be handled carefully. Hamish needed a confession, or at least enough additional evidence that even Blair couldn't mess it up. He would confront Mary himself, quietly, and see if he could get her to reveal the final pieces of the puzzle. It was risky, but then again, Hamish Macbeth had never been one to play it safe when his village was at stake. Chapter 9, Sins of the Past. Hamish found Mary at the Heritage Centre, a small stone building that housed displays of local history and traditional crafts. It was late afternoon, and the centre was officially closed, but he could see lamplight glowing in the windows. He tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old paper, with an undertone of the peat smoke that came from the historical hearth display. Mary was at a desk in the corner, working on something with intense concentration. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, before she arranged her features into their usual pleasant expression, Hamish saw something hard and calculating in her eyes. "Constable Macbeth," she said, setting down her pen. "This is a surprise. I'm just cataloguing some new donations. How can I help you?" "I'd like to talk to you about Reginald Vance," Hamish said quietly, "and about your father, Duncan Ross." The colour drained from Mary's face. For a long moment she said nothing, simply stared at him with those suddenly cold eyes. Then she rose from her chair with dignity and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening hillside. "I wondered when you'd work it out," she said. "You're cleverer than Blair, I'll give you that. How long have you known?" I started suspecting a few days ago, but I only put all the pieces together today. Duncan Ross was my father, she said, her voice flat. I was 8 years old when Gerald Vance destroyed him. My father was a good man, Constable, an honest man who worked that bogland his whole life. The Peat rights had been in our family for generations. Hamish said nothing, letting her talk. Vance came with his lawyers and his documents, claiming my father owed money on some business venture they'd invested in together. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But Vance had money and connections, and my father had nothing but his honour. The court sided with Vance. They seized our land, our home, everything. And your father took his own life. 3 months later, he couldn't bear the shame of it, the loss of everything he'd worked for. My mother sent me away to relatives in Glasgow. I was Mary Ross then, young Mary, who lost her father to a London vulture. She turned from the window, and Hamish saw tears on her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. I came back to Lochdew 15 years ago, changed my name slightly, claimed to be a widow from the borders. No one remembered the little girl who'd left all those years ago. I just wanted to be near the land again, to be part of the community my father had loved. And then Reginald Vance arrived. At first I didn't know who he was, just another arrogant London man making demands. But then I heard the name and I knew, Gerald Vance's son, come to finish what his father started, come to industrialise the bog, to destroy what little remained of my family's heritage. Mary sat down heavily, looking suddenly older. I went to see him at his cottage. I told him who I was, showed him the documents I'd kept all these years, proving my father's innocence. Do you know what he did? He laughed. He said his father had been a brilliant businessman who knew how to exploit the weak. Then he told me he'd been researching the property records and discovered something interesting. The jewellery, Hamish said. Mary's eyes widened slightly. How did you know about that? I read between the lines in Vance's ledger. He was blackmailing people, and you had a secret he'd uncovered. My father hid our family jewellery in the bog before the creditors could seize it. It wasn't much, just my grandmother's rings and a pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. But it was all we had left of our family history. I dug it up years ago after I came back to Lochdew. It should have gone to the creditors, technically. Vance threatened to expose me, to tell everyone I was a thief, to destroy the life I'd built here. So you killed him? I confronted him on the bog. I brought the Tushkar from the library, thinking perhaps I could threaten him into leaving. But he just mocked me, called my father a weakling who'd taken the coward's way out, said he'd make sure everyone in Lochdew knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. Mary's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Something broke inside me, Constable. 50 years of grief and rage and loss, all of it came flooding back. I hit him, once, hard, and he fell. And then you framed Archie MacLean. I panicked. I knew I couldn't let them connect it to me. Archie's boots were in his shed. I'd seen him leave them there that afternoon. His jacket was hanging in the pub cloakroom. I used them, then put them back before anyone noticed they were gone. I forged the threatening note using samples of his grandfather's handwriting from the library archives. I made sure to be helpful to Blair, to guide his investigation toward Archie and away from me. She looked at Hamish with something approaching defiance. Does that shock you? That I could do that to an innocent man? I told myself Archie would be cleared eventually, that Highland justice would prevail. But mostly I just didn't care. Reginald Vance was a monster just like his father. The world is better without him in it. That's not for you to decide, Hamish said quietly, isn't it? Where was justice when my father lost everything? Where was the law when Gerald Vance destroyed an honest man through lies and corruption? The system failed us then, Constable. I simply took justice into my own hands. Hamish felt the weight of her words. He understood the pain that had driven her, the decades of carrying that grief. But understanding didn't change what she'd done. There were other ways, he said. You could have exposed Vance's blackmail scheme. You could have brought his crimes to light without becoming a murderer yourself. Could I? And what good would that have done? Men like Vance always escape justice. They have money, lawyers, connections. My father had none of those things, and it killed him. Your father wouldn't have wanted this. He wouldn't have wanted you to become what you've become." Mary laughed, a bitter sound. "You didn't know my father, but you're right about one thing. He was too good for this world, and it destroyed him. I'm not good, Constable Macbeth. I haven't been good for a very long time." Hamish pulled out his phone. "I need you to come with me to the station. We'll need to give a formal statement." "Will you arrest me?" "That's not my decision to make. But I have enough evidence to clear Archie, and Blair will need someone to charge. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ross." Mary stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "Don't be sorry. I knew this day would come eventually. Part of me is almost relieved. I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not." She collected her coat and handbag with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. At the door she paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about Archie. I told myself he'd be fine, but I knew better. That was wrong of me." "Yes," Hamish said. "It was." They walked together through the twilight toward the police station. In the distance, Hamish could see the peat bog where it had all happened, dark against the fading sky. 50 years of pain and loss, ending in violence on the land that had started it all. It was, he thought, a very Highland tragedy. Old wounds that never healed, old debts that compounded over generations until they destroyed everyone they touched. Tomorrow he would have to deal with Blair, with the formal arrest, with the bureaucracy of justice. But tonight, walking beside this woman who had committed murder out of grief so old it had calcified into hate, Hamish felt only a deep, abiding sadness for all the ways people hurt each other and themselves. "The mist is coming in again," Mary observed quietly. "Aye," Hamish said, "it always does." And together they walked on through the gathering fog. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The formal interview took place at the Strathbane Police Headquarters, where DCI Blair presided with all the grace of a bull in a china shop. Hamish had called Jimmy Anderson first, explaining the situation and providing him with just enough evidence to make Blair look competent without making Hamish look too clever. It was a delicate balance, one Hamish had perfected over the years. Blair blustered into the interview room with his chest puffed out, ready to take credit for solving the complex case. Mary sat across from him, calm and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "So, Mrs. Ross," Blair began, "or should I say Miss Mary Ross, you've been living under false pretences all these years." "I changed my name legally when I married," Mary said quietly. There was nothing false about it. "But you concealed your identity, your connection to the victim's family." "I concealed nothing that was anyone's business but my own." Hamish watched from the observation room as Blair tried to intimidate Mary into a dramatic confession. It didn't work. She answered his questions with the same polite efficiency she'd brought to everything else, confirming the basic facts without embellishment or emotion. Yes, she had killed Reginald Vance. Yes, she had used Archie's boots and jacket to frame him. Yes, she had forged the threatening note. No, she didn't regret Vance's death, though she did regret the harm caused to Archie McLean. After 2 hours, Blair emerged looking triumphant. "Got her dead to rights," he announced. "Full confession. This one's going to look good on my record, Anderson." "How very good indeed." Jimmy caught Hamish's eye and suppressed a smile. They both knew the truth, that Hamish had done all the real detective work while Blair had merely presided over the final act. But that was exactly how Hamish wanted it. The next day, Archie McLean was released from custody. Hamish met him at the station entrance, where Morag was waiting with tears streaming down her face. "I knew you'd sort it out, Hamish," Archie said, gripping the constable's hand. "I never doubted you for a moment." This wasn't entirely true. Hamish had visited him in the cell and seen the despair in the man's eyes. But Highland courtesy demanded they pretend everything had proceeded according to plan. "Just doing my job," Hamish said modestly. "Your job?" Blair emerged from the building, overhearing. "Don't give yourself airs, Macbeth." This case was solved by proper detective work from Strathbane, not by some lazy village constable wandering about asking questions. "Aye, sir," Hamish agreed meekly. "You're absolutely right." Blair stumped off, satisfied, while Jimmy Anderson lingered behind. "He's already talking to the press," Jimmy murmured. "Going to be front-page news. DCI Blair cracks complex murder case, captures cunning killer." "Good," Hamish said. "Let him have his glory." "You don't mind?" "Not at all. In fact, I'm counting on it." Jimmy looked puzzled. Then understanding dawned. The promotion. Exactly. Blair's success means headquarters will be pleased with him, not looking to shuffle personnel around. And if I'm seen as too incompetent to have contributed anything meaningful to the investigation, they're hardly going to promote me to Strathbane. Are they? You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth. I'm a lazy man who knows what he wants, and what I want is to stay right here in Loughdoob. The village's reaction to Mary's arrest was complicated. Some were shocked, unable to reconcile the gentle widow they'd known with a cold-blooded killer. Others, once they learned the full story of what the Vance family had done to her father, felt a grudging sympathy. The Curry sisters were devastated. "Such a nice woman," said Nessie. "Nice woman," echoed Jessie, shaking their heads in unison. "Though I suppose she did have provocation," Nessie added. "Provocation." Angus MacDonald took the news with equanimity. "I told you the spirits whispered of old sins coming home to roost," he reminded Hamish. "You should listen to me more often." "I'll keep that in mind," Hamish said dryly. The Reverend gave a sermon about forgiveness and the dangers of letting grief turn into vengeance. Dr. Brodie quietly mentioned to Hamish that he understood the impulse, even if he couldn't condone the action. Archie McLean, now freed from suspicion, spent several days getting thoroughly drunk in celebration before his wife hauled him home by the ear. Life in Loughdoob, in other words, returned to its normal rhythms. A week after Mary's arrest, Hamish received an official letter from headquarters. He opened it with some trepidation, fearing that despite his best efforts, they might be recognising his contribution to the case. Instead, the letter commended DCI Blair for his exemplary detective work and noted that Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, while adequate in his role, had shown a disappointing lack of initiative during the investigation. It went on to say that Macbeth was clearly best suited to village policing and should remain at his current posting indefinitely. Hamish read the letter twice, then tucked it carefully into a drawer. Perfect. That evening he sat in his croft house with lugs at his feet, and Sonsi purring on the sofa beside him. He'd made himself a simple dinner of soup and bread, and he had a dram of whisky to hand. Outside, the Highland evening was settling in, soft and quiet. The mist hung over the loch like a blessing, turning everything gentle and mysterious. In the distance, he could hear the sheep calling to each other, and closer in, the sound of the burn running through his garden. This was what he'd fought to preserve. Not just his job or his posting, but this life, this place, this profound sense of belonging to something ancient and enduring. The case of Reginald Vance's murder had been solved. Justice of a sort had been done. Archie was free, Blair was happy, and Hamish remained exactly where he wanted to be. There was sadness in it, of course. Mary Ross would spend the rest of her life in prison, paying for a crime born of 50 years of grief. The village had lost one of its own, and that hurt would take time to heal. But that was the nature of police work in the Highlands. You did what you could with what you had, and you tried to minimise the damage while preserving the delicate balance of community life. Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears and took a sip of his whisky. Tomorrow he would check on his sheep, perhaps do a bit of fishing in the loch, and generally avoid doing any actual police work unless absolutely necessary. The life of a lazy village constable suited him just fine. "What do you think, Lugs?" he asked the dog. "Did we do right?" Lugs looked up at him with those strange blue eyes and wagged his tail, which Hamish chose to interpret as approval. Sonsi yawned, showing her sharp teeth, and settled more comfortably on the cushion. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping Loughdoob in its familiar embrace. somewhere in that mist, the peat bog lay silent and dark, keeping its secrets as it had for thousands of years. Duncan Ross's land, stolen and reclaimed and lost again, would continue on long after all the human drama had faded into memory. That was the way of the Highlands. The land endured, the mist came and went, and life, for all its complications and tragedies, somehow found a way to continue. Hamish Macbeth, police constable, raised his glass in a silent toast to the bog, to the village, and to the blessed peace of staying exactly where he was. Then he settled back in his chair, content with his lot, and let the quiet evening wash over him like a benediction. In the morning there would be sheep to tend and probably some minor crisis to resolve. Mrs. Wellington would likely need him to speak to the youth about something or other. The Curry sisters would have fresh gossip to share. Angus would predict something dire that wouldn't come to pass. It was a good life, a lazy life, some would say. But it was his life, and he wouldn't trade it for all the promotions in Scotland. Outside, the first stars appeared through breaks in the mist, and Hamish Macbeth, the laziest and most contented police constable in the Highlands, smiled and closed his eyes. All was right with his world.